Hey, folks, welcome to this new episode of Healthy and Awake podcast. Today's conversation is really entertaining because you look at some of the ones I've done in the past, especially the solo episodes, are very informative. A lot of the recent conversations I've had are interesting and informative and a little entertaining. This one, I feel like, is the perfect balance between healthy and awake, and it makes for a perfect episode. So I really think you're going to love this one. And I have my guest's bio in front of me. My guest is Abel James, also known as the Fat Burning Man. Abel James is a New York Times bestselling author, musician, and online creator. A coach to the coaches, Abel has been a leading voice in the world of health for more than a decade. He's starred on ABC television in documentaries and has been featured in People, Entertainment Tonight, South by Southwest, and many more. He's also the host of the award-winning Fat Burning Man Show, which has ranked as Apple's #1 health podcast in 8 countries. With over 75 million downloads and 2,000 plus 5-star reviews since its launch in 2012, Abel's podcast has won 4 awards in independent media, including People's Choice in Health and Fitness at the Podcast Awards. He's also a recording artist, musician, and virtual reality creator. Abel enjoys playing guitar and piano, writing, reading, running, hiking, and discovering delicious food with family and friends. He lives with his wife, Allison, and rambunctious yellow lab in Austin, Texas. So, yeah, we cover a lot of different things between creativity to some specifically awake topics that he has written about. And of course, we get into some health, fitness, nutrition type stuff also. So I think you're going to love this one. And without further ado, here we go. I guess, maybe a good place to start is how we kind of connected. I know you did a Dr. Kruse episode as well. What was your experience talking to that brilliant neurosurgeon?
Oh man, talking to Dr. Kruse is always a life-changing experience, no matter where I catch him. And it was about 11 or 12 years ago that I met him for the first time. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't know what to think because it's just like you're getting run over by a truck of information, and it's so far over most people's heads, including my own. It's hard to know what to make of it until you actually dive into some of the research and the science and the books and the physics and the quantum side of things. But certainly, just from a simple lifestyle perspective, one of the interesting things that happened here in Austin, Texas, about around that time ago, a little more than 10 years ago, was a lot of people came to the world of ancestral health, paleo. There were a lot of conferences, especially back then, around those principles, but the way that most people found them, oddly enough, were quite different. So the reason that like Jack was there compared to a lot of other people who focus on the research of diet or biochemistry specifically, a lot of people were kind of in their own silos. And what I noticed is that a lot of people in those silos, especially coming from the worlds of academia, were almost territorial about it. And so if Jack says something like, don't eat a banana in the middle of winter up north, everyone just like tried to laugh him out of the room, but he's so smart. That doesn't work, right? Like it doesn't work against people like that. And just because you want to remain ignorant or in your own silo doesn't change the nature of reality. And so anyway, for whatever reason, we've had these touch points over the years just a few times, and revisiting our connection from back then, talking to him just a few weeks ago on my show, and also going through his rounds of interviews on your show and a bunch of other people kind of like popping back up with Rick Rubin and Dr. Andrew Huberman, and just basically schooling Huberman on his own podcast for 6+ hours is an incredible thing to behold. So it's always an honor to collaborate with mad geniuses like Jack, and I look forward to seeing what he comes up with next for sure.
Yeah, definitely. It's cool to see his work start to really gain a lot of significant momentum because it sounds like you've been following him for even longer than I have since you connected with him at that event. But yeah, I mean, it would be different, like because you see some gurus out there, some influencers who they pop up, they catch some controversy, they say some ridiculous stuff, and then they kind of get ridiculed. Some of them chastised. Dr. Cruz is not one of those people. You know, he really he could talk and talk and talk just because his premise is so based in some pretty hard science. And you look at his Patreon, it's so detailed and he really goes into the intricacies. It's pretty cool. And it's cool to be connected with you, man. You know, your bio is so impressive. You've done all kinds of things. I have the bio that's going in at the beginning of the episode, but I was going through your book, Designer Babies Still Get Scabies, and it's very clear you're a pretty awake person. So some of the topics you cover in this book, the wealthy elite, big pharma, surveillance state, Operation Paperclip, bugs in our food, the Federal Reserve, CIA, propaganda, and I could go on. And it's all packaged in like poems. There's humor. It's not like when you hear those list of things, it's like, oh, this is going to be a pretty heavy, intense book. But you do a beautiful job of making it enjoyable. So my question for you is what kind of led to this awake state that you seem to be in?
Thanks, man. I really appreciate your feedback. Uh, and I released that book of poems and satire back in 2019. So it was really radical. And a lot of people weren't saying that stuff back then. Post pandemic, a lot of these terms and conspiracies and three-letter agencies and talking about that has become much more, I don't want to say mainstream because it's still kind of like over on the side somewhere, over on some alternative platforms, not allowed on the main ones mostly. But for me, it was actually getting a hearty taste of censorship way back in like 2013, 2014. And as soon as I started talking about censorship, I realized I was getting censored more and more. And a lot of other people were just pointing their fingers at me, like mostly saying, no, you're not being censored. That is completely ridiculous. Shadow banning isn't a thing. And this is years ago. Now, most people have kind of accepted this. And then other people are saying like, well, okay, you probably deserved it. You said something that you shouldn't have said. And I'm like, what exactly did I say? And it's difficult for them to counter that sort of experience. So anyway, I've had this this online platform in the world of health for about 11 or 12 years. Jack was one of the very first people I interviewed on my podcast back in the day. And I've tried to keep it family friendly and like accessible to people who don't necessarily have an advanced degree. Now, we go down some rabbit holes and talk about advanced things sometimes, but I think it's important. Like one of the things I wanted to do, one of the reasons I got into that world of health and alternative health specifically, is because I realized that the mainstream is tricking people and wrong, tricking them into ill health and confusing and confounding the situation. So trying to have people on to talk about the truth in a way that is also not completely off the wall, you know, where like you can listen to it with your kids and it's not going to sound like we're all crazy nut job woo woo, whatever. There's a mix of science, there's a mix of other things, no harsh language for the most part. And so I would think that running a blog like that and running podcasts, doing interviews, that the big dogs and the three-letter agencies or whoever is doing this top-down shadow banning, pharma companies, whatever it is, would mostly leave me alone. And at first they did. But after a time talking about some of the subjects that you brought up, I realized what is off limits. And so back in 2014, I had a couple of interviews and blog posts that clearly had a number, like over 1,000, it seemed like, paid trolls who came to me on my podcast, leaving all these comments on various channels, what have you. As the years went on, I noticed that there were more and more words that I couldn't say. And as soon as I did, it's like my YouTube video would get half taken down, you know, like literally cut off right as soon as we talk about certain subjects. It disappears. And what I noticed is that these various shadow banning and censorship tactics weren't, you know, just on Twitter or just on YouTube. They were clearly almost engineered all at exactly the same time, as if Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are all in cahoots and doing this together, which they're not supposed to be, you know, in terms of capitalism. but it was very clear to me that that was happening. So as a way to just kind of process all of this and realize that I was almost forced into self-censorship way back then in the, mid 2010s and certainly late 2010s, I decided to write about it. And I've been a musician and a songwriter. That was my first career, and I've been doing that for a long time. And I found that, if you can take some of these very, very difficult concepts and things that can be very emotional and damaging to your own spirit and mind as you process them, if you can find a way to be creative about it, it's a wonderful way to process your own feelings. And hopefully, if you develop that skill, you can also kind of make these little poems, songs. It's almost encapsulating a memory, a lesson, or an idea. And if you can do that in less than a page or just a few words, then you can get. I realize that I can say a lot more outside of my platform if I just make a few rhymes and people don't, or if I make it a little bit funny. But if I just stand here in front of the microphone and I say it exactly as it is, it's very likely that this interview or other interviews won't see the light of day. So I found myself really talking around a lot of different issues and hating it. So I figured might as well come up with this alternative approach, throw out some satire and see what happens. And the response to it was actually really good. I thought that people might burn me at the stake because, like I said, a lot of those concepts back then were not widely accepted. But now, one of the people who had a quote at the beginning of the book, he said, back in 2019, when I released it, it seemed like some sort of dystopian fantasy. And by 2020, it was basically the truth. It came true. And so I'm not necessarily happy about that fact, but I'm definitely prepared to write a lot more, and I have been. So I also wanted to present it as a challenge to other people who call themselves creators, or influencers. I hate that word, but people who call themselves creators. You don't have to just be in the little box that the internet has created for you. You don't need to just be on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and all these other places where you're censored and controlled. You can also create on your own terms, and it's very important to do so.
It's interesting because you have your element of creativity that you carry out through music, through writing, and I feel like you don't often see that in the health and wellness space. And it became very clear to me as I read your book, like the rhythm in it. I was like, okay, I get the music now. I can see the rhythmic element in this book. And so how do these all connect between, music and creative writing and the health and wellness space?
It's interesting because, to bring Jack Kruse back to the conversation, the wonderful doctor, Uncle Jack, he doesn't necessarily, maybe he does, but the way he talks about it often is that he's not really an artist, and artists are over here and scientists are over here. He certainly approaches all of this with an artistic mind or some sort of artistic lens that many scientists don't, in fact, have. So one of the things that the the artistry perspective allows in this world is that you're not as likely to be in the silo, right? So if I'm only talking about the degree that I have from college or the advanced degree or what have you, and I don't have an advanced degree, I chose not to, then it's very easy to become territorial about what you've learned, think that that's the truth, and go from there. As you put yourself in this one-up position. Everyone else is down here. You're talking down to them because you're the expert. And artists very much realize that what they create, yes, some of it kind of comes from them, but a lot of it comes from somewhere else, the super consciousness. And that it takes humility to understand that. And I wish that more scientists, researchers, and people of that ilk would take that perspective where you don't have to be in that silo and talking from up here all the time, talking down at people. If you're open to other ways of looking at this or other ways of thinking about it, other ways of explaining all of these things, then you can learn a lot more, and you're going to be collaborating with people like Jack and Erwan LaCour instead of, just a Harvard-trained doctor who sticks to the plan and says the things that they can say and never says or even thinks about the things that they can't say. So I've been listening to a few of your recent shows, and it's interesting because my background is I did really well in academia, and could have definitely kept going in that direction. And so I went to one of those fancy Ivy League schools, and I thought I would get the best education there. And in many ways, I really did, but it came more from the peer group and having deep conversations with other intellectuals and curious people. Certainly, I learned a lot from professors as well, but I noticed that it's completely limited to the 3D world. And that was weird because even in high school, writing creatively and in music, yeah, you can kind of dip into the other pieces of things, right? Where there's more going on. There's more to the conversation than just what you see in the 3D world, especially if we're taking a class in theology or what have you. And so I realized while I was at Dartmouth that these silos were being built and we were being shuffled into them. And if we didn't take a job in investment banking, consulting, become a lawyer, or become some professor, then you're still kind of shuffled into this way of thinking. You don't really learn about spirit, super consciousness, woo-woo stuff at all. It's poo-pooed, and you're a fool if you even go in that direction. And so what I've noticed over the past couple of decades, now that I've been out of school for quite some time, is that many of the people who pursued those traditional paths, say in investment banking or consulting or the business world, where they've been dressing up in suits and shaking hands for a while. And truth be told, I did that for a few years to pay off my loans too. So I kind of know a bit about how this works. But what I realized is having conversations with those people when they were my roommates in college, or we were just hanging out back in school, what an expansive mind and what an expansive conversation it was back then. When you meet up now, it's more just like, you can tell that they've been spending the last 15 or 20 years in a bank, wearing a suit, shaking hands, talking about the things that you're allowed to talk about, and the rest of the mind with the possibilities and the things that we don't know, and the other things that maybe the passions and the dreams, that has fatigued and atrophied to the point where sometimes having a conversation with someone, you realize that this expansive person who had the most incredible mind you could ever imagine back then is now just like any other typical banker. And also, why are we all here is a question that artists in the creative mind, we ask that pretty much every day, whether it's out of depression, suffering, or it's just like the happy sides of creativity. It's something that we're used to asking ourselves. When you just kind of like are shuffled into making widgets with this, kind of typical life, I think there's a tendency for a lot of people to have their minds and their spirits fatigue in that way. So anyway, I've tried to run my career in the world of health and beyond, in music and everything else, to challenge myself and challenge other people to say no to that sort of behavior and that sort of trajectory, which means embracing a lot of challenges, because it's certainly a lot easier to pay the bills if you just take a job. And people with responsibilities, and everyone has responsibilities and they grow over time. I don't want to throw shade at anyone who is making sacrifices on behalf of their family and taking a job that they don't enjoy. But at the same time, I would hope that we could all, especially the cream of the crop, the people who are very intelligent, very driven, and very creative naturally, don't let yourself be sucked down the wrong path into this, pigeonhole where you're painted into a corner and you can never talk about the things that really interest you, because that means that you've stopped growing. And I think we'll all have more to offer the world, the more eccentric and unique we become.
It sounds like you were able to recognize that the system doesn't foster the creative spirit. If anything, it diminishes it. And that was my experience as well. I was always in trouble in school for just challenging the status quo, being skeptical of authority. And I was even on a path to go further down academia when I decided I don't like this at all. I don't feel like I can think or speak freely. If anything, my thinking is being outsourced to authority figures, and they're just outsourcing their thinking to other authority figures. So I definitely understand where you're coming from. And to take this even further, you clearly have this creative spirit. How do you channel this, especially between your different modes of distribution, between music, between writing, between health and fitness? How do you get this all organized, or what's your process there?
Still working on it. But I would say something that hopefully other people could take that's of value is for decades, pretty much since high school, I have sworn by having a blank page around me, a blank notebook that's just ready to go. And I'll make to-do lists, but more importantly, whenever there's an idea floating through the air, whether it's a rhyme or a question or something that I want to wrestle with a little bit, I make sure to have that nearby so I can just scribble it down. And so over the course of weeks and months, I have these many, many pages of ideas that don't go together. And so I've heard many people explain that writing is making a mess and cleaning it up. And I swear
Yeah.
by that. That's definitely how it works. And so it's it's not always as organized as sitting down in the morning and saying, I'm going to write for 60 minutes and just having it come out. Because when you're flirting with a muse, especially like the more creative of an act it is, that's not exactly how it works. It doesn't come to you when it's convenient because it's not necessarily coming from you. And a lot of people who have lived their life in art kind of explain that it's more like tuning into a frequency where people in disparate parts of the world, they can be worlds away from each other in different countries, will come up with exactly the same invention at the same time, or they'll write a song that's almost exactly the same, come up with the same ideas. And that challenges the idea of like where all of this is coming from. But I would say if you want to, kind of engage that gear in your own life, then it's very important to empty your cup, so to speak, get all of that junk out of your mind, try to open it up, get into the creative state. Like Rick Rubin's book, A Creative Act, is absolutely fantastic. And I've become obsessed with it in the past few weeks since Jack turned me on to it. But the idea isn't that you want to churn out a bunch of ideas and work from yourself. It's more about putting yourself into that state that makes creating art inevitable. And I love that way of thinking about it. I love that way of explaining it because it's not organized. Like the creative way of going about a lot of this stuff is more like, oop, I'll grab that and I'll put this over here. And then it sits over there and festers for a while. And it's just like, dang it. I should probably finish that or I should do something with it. And then you might 10 years later, 15 years later. Other times, you sit down and a complete song or a complete something comes out in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, a half an hour, sometimes even less. It just comes out almost fully formed. And you don't always know when that's going to happen. But I'm sure, with your background in comedy and interests there, very, very similar, where you can't force yourself to just write funny stuff. But at the same time, you do need to build that habit of engaging with that creative spark and then opening yourself up to the ideas when they do come. And sometimes you can sit down and just write for 4 hours, but that is definitely the exception. Doesn't happen every day. And so long story short, I try to, for these various projects, capture the ideas when they come. Not on the computer though. Hardly ever do I use technology for this process. It's usually outside in the sunshine or just like on my couch under the skylight. Sometimes in the evening, but making sure that you have that way to capture it. It could be voice memos too. Like you don't have to completely get away from technology necessarily, but I have noticed that it's a lot more difficult to maintain that creative flow as soon as your phone is bleeping and booping at you, and the more that you're on technology, the less likely you're going to stay in that flow. So it's really important to capture those ideas. And then when it comes to organizing them, I generally do that on the computer. When the critic comes in, the editor, throw it in the word processor and then get to work that way. But that's a fundamentally different type of work than the more creative part, which is kind of coming up with those ideas. So stream of consciousness, editor, and then publishing it and putting it out there to the world is a whole other piece, and I've done that with just a small fraction of what I've created. So that's the other challenge is depending on your goals and what you want to do. Sometimes it's really important for you to release things. Other times that song is just for you.
There is something to be said about just pulling it out of the ether. Like it's just there in your freest sense. And sometimes when you try to force it, it doesn't produce anything. You kind of have to allow it to arrive. I'm big on the audio notes because sometimes I have so many like big thoughts in my head. I just need to vomit it out in a way. And the other thing you said that really resonated with me was sometimes you have to like let it simmer, look at it with fresh eyes, because it can be so easy to criticize other people's work. It's probably the easiest thing to do. And so sometimes you go back and look at your, well, I'll say my own work. I'll look at my own work that I don't even remember writing this, and it's so easy to criticize that and to reconstruct it because I don't have that ego that might be attached when I initially put it on paper. But you're also the author of a best-selling book, The Musical Brain, which explores the evolutionary origins of music. So I'll ask outright, what are the evolutionary origins of music?
I love this question. So it's always been befuddling to me because music is everywhere. No one can really deny that. Even though music has been in many ways devalued and commodified in the past few years, and even to the next few generations coming up more than it was for us, you can see that music is in elevators. It's in grocery stores. It's in every shopping mall. It's in the Ubers that you're riding around in, and we put it on for ourselves as well. Music is just something that is always there, but it doesn't really serve any sort of obvious evolutionary function, right? It's like speaking to each other and communicating. That makes sense why we would do that, Um, making love to have children and procreate totally makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. But like listening to Bon Jovi, I don't know. That's it's not quite so obvious. So for me, growing up, I went through some hard stuff, and especially as a teenager, I realized that I didn't have access to the ability to feel it and cry. Especially as dudes growing up, there's a tendency to shut yourself down as soon as you start feeling something. You're not a man anymore if you kind of express some of these feelings of vulnerability or hopelessness or helplessness. And in the face of life's tragedies, it's really important to engage with that part of your body. You don't want that to atrophy. And I realized that it's through playing music. My brother was a drummer, and especially at the time, I was playing guitar and singing, but mostly shredding guitar. And it was the way that I realized that I could kind of access that piece of me was throwing on something like Jimi Hendrix or Stevie Ray Vaughan, which was well beyond my ability at the time, and just shredding along with it and trying to keep up until I got so overwhelmed that like my heart opened up and a flood of tears came out about the things that, I ultimately really wanted to cry about, losing someone who was very, very close to me. And so why does that work? And why do other people kind of engage with this, whether they have a lot of musical training or zero? Like people can listen to a song from their childhood, and you can almost like smell the laundry sheets from the house that you were in the first time you heard that song. It turns your brain on. And so this is a long-winded way of answering that question. The best functional use of music and explanation for why it exists to me is that back in the day, before humans had the ability to speak the same language because geographically they were far apart or they were different tribes, you could hear a tribe or a group of people that wasn't yours. And, if you didn't speak the same language, you could hear them coming before you saw them, right? And if you hear war drums on one side of the world, and you hear war drums on the other side of the world, they're very, very similar. There's something in our physiology that knows what an aggressive beat sounds like. And it's, if you hear that, boom, it's like, all right, don't get in these guys' way. I'm not going to mess with that. On the other end, you can tell if it's a wedding or if it's a celebration, if they want to party. And it doesn't matter what side of the world you're on. These sounds, the rhythm, the way that the melody is built is wired into us. And not just culturally, that happens too. But even before culture kind of gets a hold of us, we know what happy and sad music sounds like. And so if that's built into us, then music and musical sounds provide the ability for early humans to communicate with each other in the absence of a spoken language. Sometimes you can almost like add a bit of music or musical speech to the language. And we do this all the time. If someone doesn't speak our language or we don't speak theirs, we have this exaggerated sing-songy, almost like mother speaking to a child type deal. That's the way that we communicate. And basically, an easy way of thinking about it is music is a primitive form of communication amongst humans and animals. And animals use this absolutely as well. And it allows us to kind of supersede the need for spoken language. It's not all that necessary if you can communicate the emotional content of one human to another, or one human group to another. And through those connections, hopefully you can foster a larger community. And so when we listen to music now, it engages the primitive parts of our brains that were kind of there before spoken language, and it also engages our physiology. We have this ability to and tendency to entrain to certain beats and rhythms. So if you listen to a song and you're walking down the street, this happens to me all the time, and it's happened to most people, where you realize, you look down at your feet and you're walking exactly to the beat of that song. And so we have this tendency to entrain to these different types of music and different sounds. And it's something that can be used for good or evil, it should be said. For the most part, most of us use it quite innocently. But there is, to me, especially the more that I've learned, this is one of the reasons that music is in almost every religious practice, whether it's organized or not. When you add music and sound to spoken word, then it becomes like a mantra, and it programs your subconscious. And so it's not like you can never eat Cheetos, and listen to the musical equivalent of junk food, but realize that it's doing something to you and it's programming your subconscious. Whether you like it or not, it's happening at all times. So be very intentional about what you're listening to and what you choose to put on.
I am so glad I asked you that question because that was some powerful stuff. And it makes so much sense because I've always noticed this propagandistic element to music and the way you describe it as a sort of primitive communication tool that can be used to build a community. And then you extrapolate from that. You even mentioned religion too. It can really be used to get everybody on the same page, on the same mental wavelength. And you even said that there's a possibility for good and evil there. And that's just like when I talk about propaganda. Propaganda is a weapon that can be used against people or can be used to defend yourself. It can be used for good or bad. And the same seems to be the case for music, especially you look at the state of music nowadays, the actual content of the music, a lot of it's garbage. But then you could also, I guess, explore philosophically the way that music is so unnaturally broadcasted today. Because you could make a case that with technology, the way, even with Twitter, even the way we can read words and language, music is no different. You have to wonder the effects of the way that technology allows that music to propagate versus the original primitive manifestation of music. You're all kind of in an actual group. You're sitting there, you're playing the music of your tribe. It really builds this positive sense of collectivism. You really get everybody on the same page. That really has my gears turning.
Right on. Yeah, I think about this stuff all the time. It's so fascinating, but it's interesting also that no one ever really talks about that. And maybe it's because it is so very powerful, and it is. I mean, Muzak and some of these other things pumped into shopping malls and that sort of thing. It changes how much we buy. That's why a lot of these corporations do that. In terms of military technology, we know that sound affects people, and you can use it as a weapon. Whether it's just music or something far beyond that, it has been weaponized for many, many decades, probably a lot longer than that. But if you go down this rabbit hole, there is a lot more there than most people realize.
It definitely does influence our behavior in so many ways, and it can really put our defenses down. Where if you have a salesperson, hey, I'm a salesman, I'm going to try to sell you on this thing. Like they're very open about, it's very clear what they're trying to do. But then you have music that, even like, look at Eminem, right? Every other word in his music is like a brand name pharmaceutical. That is not without effect, right? That's there deliberately. You could say that that's a type of weaponized music because people are listening to it, they're enjoying it, they have their defenses down. And it really, like you said, on a subliminal level, can really register things in a way that if it were Eminem just talking like, hey, buy Xanax, and just like really throwing brand name pharmaceuticals at you in regular speech, definitely would not have the same impact.
Yeah, and Eminem in particular has been open about the fact that he's playing a persona and has been for his whole career. And so if that's true, I would love to take a look at the contract, because I've gotten a few contracts from TV production companies, music companies, books, things like that. And what those contracts generally say, and have been saying for many years now, is that they own you 360 degrees. They own your universe, and any universe that is yet to be discovered, they own you. And that's why you sign on the dotted line, and all of a sudden you get all this money and support. Although you don't always get all that money. You can sell your soul for a few $100s if you want to, or probably less. But that's the fascinating piece to me, where it's like most of the people in kind of the A-list celebrity category that I've found are not practicing free speech or free expression at all. They are told what to say, more than not. And they are also told what they cannot say. When you sign that deal, you're signing for someone else to either put the stamp of approval on the work that you're going to be releasing to the world, or you're setting yourself up for some sort of ghostwriter situation, which is much more common in popular music, especially going back in history, than most people understand. And you're also giving someone the ability to shelve your songs or your work or your ideas that they don't want to get out in the world. And these people are not A-list celebrities. The people who are deciding what the A-list celebrities can and cannot say in the public sphere do not want anyone to know their name. They will not be out there advertising how great they are. No, they're collecting money and they're collecting power, and that's what they're optimized for. And they're taking advantage of people who are trying to optimize for artistry. A lot of these people who become the big names and the big celebrities, it's not really on them necessarily to know what they're up against. Usually this is a surprise. It's not until they release their second or third album and the top-down controllers kind of say, no, you can't say that. You're going to say this instead. It's not until then that they realize it. Sometimes they try to back out of it, and that gets very, very ugly. And so it's, growing up wanting to be a rock star and wanting to be, like a successful musician, whatever that means, and then coming up to the reality of that, especially looking at the contracts over the years, a few different kinds. It's like, wow, if you ever find yourself in that situation, read every line. And if there's something that you can't sign, walk away from it. Do not ever sign something that gives anyone control over your free expression, your free thought, your free speech, or what have you. Even if it doesn't say it that explicitly, that's usually what those contracts are after.
And if they ask you to sign it in blood, that's probably a big red flag too. Um, So, I mean, forget the pharmaceuticals. You look at the state of music today, you have Lil Nas X having sex with the devil, Doja Cat. I saw there was a new song praising Satan, like by name. I think his name is Sam Smith, is another one dressing up like the devil. And I understand it can be easy to go, oh, it's just like rockers, doing their thing. And even, historically that's been true, going back to like Black Sabbath and that sort of thing. So I understand it can be easy to dismiss, but at the same time, it seems worthy of scrutiny. Like we should maybe pay attention to, just like we pay attention to the food that we consume, we should probably pay attention to the music that we can consume as well, and how these things might be affecting us. I think that's at least one of the many possible takeaways from this. But you also mentioned it looked like you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I was just going to challenge people with a question of, what's the difference between singing with your congregation, spiritual songs, to, program your community consciousness together, hopefully moving up, not down. What's the difference between that and singing a Sam Smith song, about the devil or whatever at a wedding? It's a pretty similar act as a human being, a human spirit. And so I challenge people to draw those connections, because, yeah, it might just be kind of silly and outrageous behavior to dress up like the devil and kind of it's so common though. Like when you see that and you see most of the artists, it's not just like Prince and Madonna and Sam Smith. It's like almost all of the popular ones are at some point like dancing around pools of blood, dressed up like the devil and like worshiping Satan. It's not even that extreme anymore because they've been doing it for so long. And I've met enough musicians who have experienced this. And as soon as they showed up for the music video and they're just like, yeah, you're going to paint some blood on your face and you're going to do this. And they're like, no, I'm not. And they're just like, okay, your career is finished. And it
Yeah.
was. Like, that's happened to a few people I know.
It's an interesting world. It's really hard not to have conspiracy theories when you see hundreds of celebrities making the same symbolic hand gestures on the images with the circle around their eye and like the satanic horns.
Artists who
Again,
can form like that, not naturally. I sure wouldn't, you know?
that's a good point. Yeah, like creative people, you would think like creative is divergent inherently. They're kind of all over the place. And so for them all to be, singing the same song to use a, I guess, appropriate metaphor there, it is definitely suspicious for sure. Hey, just give me 1 minute here. Sorry to interrupt, but I just need to ask for your help really quick. If you enjoy the show, I'm just asking you straight up to please give this show 5 stars on Apple Podcast or Spotify if you listen to it either of those places. Or if you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed. And make sure you please tell your friends if you think that somebody would like my content, or maybe somebody even needs to hear some of this stuff, right? Maybe they're not really awake, or maybe they're waking up and they could use some of this information. So yeah, that's it. Just please help support the show, because with some of the stuff that I say on this platform, algorithms don't exactly love me because I'm challenging their authority constantly. So your help would be appreciated. But without further ado, here we go back to the show. But I do, maybe this is a good place to transition into like the health side of things, because you mentioned that you've looked at contracts before. Obviously, you've been on TV, a celebrity coach. What was that experience like?
Really interesting. This is back in 2015, and I was contacted by a production company that was ultimately making a show for ABC television that was meant to be like The Biggest Loser fitness competition, but more positive. And so I was intrigued by the idea. I kind of dismissed it at first, but I looked more into it, and ultimately, it seemed like a good fit at the time. Although even I was tricked a little bit. But uh, it, so once I showed up, I had had a few people, including my wife, who had been involved with TV before, and kind of gave me a little bit of emotional and mental preparation for what I might be up against, which is, I don't want to say too much because I'm not sure how consistent this is amongst different pieces of television or what have you.
Did they make you sign in blood and sell your soul to do the
It's
TV
not
show? Is that
quite
what
to
you're
that level, but it's close. They definitely line you up for character assassination on day one. And they put you in situations where they're just like, yeah, you can trust us. We're a room full of people, and this is what we do, and yada, yada, yada. And then you show up when the cameras are on. That is not the situation that you're in. It's kind of like running psychological experiments, which I was in plenty in college, and I ran a few in college as well. Nothing major, but a lot of times the people who are showing up for these psych experiments are told one thing, but the reason that they're actually there is very different. So they're not studying the thing that they say that they're studying. And that's how reality TV works as well, and TV in general, anything that's supposed to be reality. And so it's a total misnomer. And another piece of it too is that in that contract, that particular one, there was a very, very strange line to me when I read it the first. There were a lot of strange lines, but this one in particular said that they could basically own my name and likeness and use, if I wasn't willing to do or say something, then they could have a body double and a voice actor say exactly what they wanted me to say, even if it wasn't me, and publicize that and make that part of who I am to the public world. And so I literally had to pay my lawyer more money than I was paid for the entire TV show to make sure that that didn't happen. And I couldn't believe how boilerplate that was, because in the years that have passed, I've met a lot of other people who have been on various programs, whether they're nature shows or in the world of health or sports or whatever it is. And that line is in a lot of those contracts. And when you watch someone on TV, especially if the lights are a little low and it sounds a little bit different or something, it's very likely that it's a body double and a voice actor, kind of running that storyline or that narrative that they wanted for your character. but they're selling it as the real you to the entire world. And so for me, this is 2015 when I'm kind of coming to terms with a lot of this and going on the TV show. And of course, the president was a reality TV star who, kind of was put into power at exactly the same time. And I'm just like, wow, this is a little bit dangerous, because reality TV is not a reflection of reality, and obviously politics isn't either. But as the show went on, I was teamed up with a man named Kurt Morgan, 47 years old, 352 pounds. And everyone on the show was trying to lose around 50 to 100 pounds and ultimately run a half marathon and do these fitness challenges. And so it was pretty clear that they didn't really want our team doing well, because we were the meat eaters, and they didn't, the powers that be don't really want people talking about eating grass-fed, grass-finished, healthy animals, pasture-raised. They don't want talk about intermittent fasting and going out in the sunshine and other things like that. So they kind of like set us up to lose, but in spite of that, we totally crushed. And Kurt lost, I think it was 15 pounds the first week, 11 pounds the second week, #1 in the fitness competitions and all these other things. And over the course of those 3.5 or 4 months, he ultimately lost 87 pounds. He was able to go rock climbing for the first time because he finally was a low enough weight to do so, finished the half marathon. And in doing so, he really inspired so many people to embrace this lifestyle of being more in touch with the natural world, not being afraid of eating healthy meats and eating healthy fats from time to time, not being afraid of compressing your eating window and doing a lot of things that doctors say that you shouldn't be doing, not being afraid to skip breakfast with all the processed cereals and processed carbs and flours and that sort of thing. I couldn't believe that they allowed me to say some of these things on television, because like in the middle of me saying that during the commercial break, they're advertising the things I'm speaking out against. But enough
Wow.
people saw that show where it's like, over the next year or two, I had so many emails coming in from people who were just like, I watched Kurt on that TV show lose all that weight and get healthy again. He looked 10 years younger. And so I decided to try it myself, except I didn't exercise, and I lost 100 pounds in a year. And I'm like, you did what? Like, not even talking to me or having any sort of coach involved. They just like bought my book or found some of my podcasts, put it into action, didn't even add the exercise part, lost 100 pounds in a year. More than one person did that. And ultimately I interviewed a few on my podcast, but so we were able to turn it into something that ultimately did good, but it was definitely a monster risk to take. And I don't know if I would do it again, especially under the circumstances now, but it was an incredible educational experience in how media is made, and also how most of it is kind of built around the exploitation of people who are there to try to do good. Most of the people who were on the show and in other shows were there to try to do good. They're not there to try to get big or be on TV or something like that. But oftentimes it's a world of exploitation to a degree that I had never conceived of. And so it doesn't make me ever want to move to LA and kind of live the Hollywood lifestyle. It is not what it seems.
Well, congrats to both of you for being able to achieve that. That's really cool. And I do want to ask you more about the actual health aspect of things. But I guess first I'm curious, how did you feel about the actual broadcasted show versus your experience while filming? Because it sounds like they were telling you some of the things you could or couldn't say. I'm wondering, like, were you happy with the final result? And did you feel like you could do what you actually wanted to do, or how much of that was actually controlled?
Yeah, that is such a great question. Some of the shows are very controlled. The one that I was on was leaving some stuff to chance, because you can't fake all of it. Like, you can fake some things, but certainly over the course of 4 months, you can't fake someone's body transforming unless you're putting them on a bunch of drugs or something like that. And who knows if that wasn't involved in our case, but that could be involved and is involved in many other shows and in some other cases. So, thankfully, because of the contract that I signed, which made it so they couldn't manipulate what I said or did in real life, the only thing that I really experienced was there were some things where they would re-edit the way that the timeline worked. So
Yeah.
if someone said something, here's an example. So someone said something that was kind of like nasty or whatever, or like an ad hominem attack against someone else. And earlier, I had laughed about something completely different. Like Kurt and I are laughing and just going like, ha ha ha, this is great. And so they put us laughing right after something really nasty, making it appear as if we are totally without any sort of human soul and laughing at this person's, mistake or whatever. I don't even remember what the specific thing was. And so it looks like it happened that way. If
Just to be clear, I do that as well for this show. So I'm going to cut it off and make you look bad.
As long as you're not using a voice actor and a body double, we'll be good.
We'll see.
There were a few things like that happened, but that's pretty minor. That's pretty laid back. I've heard other stories of people basically getting liquored up and then, or like other people will liquor up the person who's supposed to be on screen and then they film them. Or they'll say something that completely takes them out of balance behind the scenes. Then they throw a camera on them just to try to make sure that you're off balance. And the whole point is to get people to be extreme. And the more, the easier they are to hate, the more people want to watch it, right? They want controversy and that sort of thing, or at least production and the people who are making the TV shows. That's their main objective, is to ratchet up the amount of controversy and hate. But all of that said, I think most of the people who we worked with, it was there was a little bit of that side of things, but for the most part, good people. They did a good job, and most of us were there because there were multiple coaches and trainers, not just me. Most people were there to help each other get healthy. And over the course of that experience, I think most of us really learned a lot and made some wonderful inroads, even if we had different ways of going about it. Because some of the teams were vegan, although they didn't do very well at all. Some of the teams kind of focused on eating very little and running a lot. They did pretty well, but, more in a short-term timeline. And then another piece of it was I wanted to see what the traditional media world still had to offer back in 2015, 2016, because my podcast at that point already had, I think, more than 10 million downloads and listens. And so I had a lot of experience in the world of alternative media and independent media. I wanted to see if TV was still a thing. And it seemed to me that was kind of the last gasp of TV being a big cultural behemoth. And ever since, now, yeah, there's Netflix and Amazon Prime, but you don't really hear much about traditional TV. It's kind of passé, and now people are scrolling TikTok and Instagram instead of being on there, and everything is short form. So it's not as important as most people think it is. Back then, it still was a little bit, but I'm glad to see that it's become even less important now.
Why do you think the vegans didn't do so well?
There are a lot of reasons, but if you eliminate entire food groups like protein in particular, animal protein, it makes it a lot more difficult to get the results that you need to if you're exercising a lot and trying to build muscle or recalibrate your body composition. So with vegans, there's a way to go about it, but it's a lot more complicated. There can be a lot of nutrient deficiencies involved. And for the most part, you either need to go really, really heavy on the roughage or really heavy on the carbs. And if you do so, some people are better physiologically able to do that. But most people eating good old-fashioned eggs, beef, chicken, fish with veggies and trying to minimize the amount of sugars and flours and what have you, that is a much more reasonable approach to engage in long-term, kind of like a Mediterranean style diet, but also dialing down the amount of baked goods and that sort of thing. Most of us know that that's kind of what a balanced diet looks like. And so if you're looking at all plant-based and vegan-based eating, it's way too easy for most people to buy a bunch of vegan products, and that's what they live on. And so it's harder to buy a bunch of products that are made out of steak and protein. It's not as easily monetized. And so if you do engage in eating animal protein, then you're eating real food. And it's best to do it from animals that were raised under the sunshine, eating outside the way that animals are meant to live. That's far better than eating factory farmed animals. But even, the lower quality animal foods that you're eating, if you give a few of those, with some omega-3s and B12 to people who have been eating vegan for a long time, they're going to come back to life. And it's really important to have physical energy, vitality, and vigor if you're going to be going out and running a half marathon or something like that. And so over time, you can build up deficiencies or you can keep on chugging. And if people aren't totally dialed in the plant-based way of going about things, then you're kind of setting yourself up for a few roadblocks and obstacles at some point. Maybe not right away. And also, I don't personally eat vegan. I had been vegetarian and tried vegan in the past. It did not work well for me. For some people, if they really believe it, you dial in your nutrition, you do your labs. I've seen some people do pretty well, maybe okay. I'm not sure how often they're like caving in on a weekend when they're drunk and ordering a whole meat lover's pizza and behind the scenes or what have you. But I think if you can hit the plant-based eating and approach to life and combine that with fish here and there or a few eggs here and there, more like leaning into the vegetarian side of things, I think you could do pretty well that way too. But for the most part, meats and veggies are the way to go. You could even do the all meat thing, but I'm more on the having some amount of balance. I think is important for not just longevity of your physical body, but also longevity of like your spirit and your will to be alive. It's really important to have diversity in the way that you're eating because it keeps things more interesting, I think. But if you want to do the extreme elimination approach, especially for a shortened timeline, then that can be really effective, whether it's on the all meat or even the all vegan side.
Yeah, the state of food is so interesting because the same tricks with like cereal, the big food industry, they package cereal in a way where, look, it lowers cholesterol. Look, it's a good source of protein. And they put all these buzzwords and phrases and colors, all while that music is playing in the background to get you to feel like you're making a healthy decision. And to the scrutinizing eye, you see that they are playing the same tricks on people who want to be healthy. And that's true of the people who are vegan. And you look at a lot of the processed foods that they slap a vegan label on there and they call that healthy. Same thing with keto. A lot of the keto products that you see out there, they just slap the label on there and present it as healthy, even though it might not be.
Might not even be keto a lot of the time.
Yeah, exactly. And so it can definitely, I understand how it can be confusing for a lot of people. And how does the wild diet fit into all this? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. So going back in time, it was pretty obvious, 11 or 12 years ago that even the paleo word was going to be abused. And the word nature and natural, like if you apply that to food and they say it's all natural, even back then it meant nothing. It certainly means nothing now as well. But the natural world matters. The laws of nature matter. And so the word wild appealed to me because it's kind of a proxy for that way of thinking about all of this. It's not man over nature. It's natural laws, and we need to try to change our own behavior, way of eating and living to work with those laws within Mother Nature's system. And so the wild diet approach is kind of what I mentioned before. It doesn't need to be super complicated, but if you're eating foods that were recently alive and well, be them animal or plants, then you're pretty much doing it right. Staying away from the obvious things that are not good for us: flours, baked goods, processed sugars, industrialized oils. Eliminating those out of your diet to the extent that you can. You don't need to be perfect all the time, but you want to get the majority of your caloric load from healthy animal foods, not being afraid of ruminant animals and red meat and that sort of thing. You want to get plenty of quality fats and not be afraid of those, and not be afraid of necessarily dietary cholesterol. It's still important to look at your labs and, avoid having high triglycerides and other biomarkers that could indicate poor health. But for the most part, if you are eating real food, even if you're eating animal foods, your biomarkers will be going in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction. So eating from the world of nature, food that has lived and been raised the way that nature intended, is a super important part of all of this, whether you're looking at your plate or the farm where your food comes from. And so it's all about engaging with regenerative agriculture, pasture raised animals, grass fed and finished, depending on which animal you're talking about. And also, it's pretty cool that over the course of time, there are even companies in the world of seafood that have found kind of like a middle road between factory farming and the wild world. Because the truth is, the oceans are so polluted at this point that a lot of the wild caught fish are extremely high in heavy metals, all sorts of different kinds of chemicals and metals and that sort of thing. You don't want that. And so now there are some pretty neat companies and approaches to farming that are coming where you see that the animals that you're eating are actually tested for heavy metals before you put them in your body. And that's kind of what we're after. It doesn't need to literally mean that everything that you're eating is wild and you're like out picking berries and fishing for your own fish. Because truth be told, I grew up in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire, and we were fishing for perch and pickerel and a bunch of fish in our backyard. We had a pond. And later we learned that those fish are extremely high in heavy metals from all the various industry that's been happening for, a couple of centuries now, especially up in the Northeast, with all polluting all the ponds and the rivers and that sort of thing. So we need to be conscious of the fact that we don't necessarily live in a perfect world anymore. So even if we need to simulate that to some extent with our food, or at least put up some level of defense to make sure that we're not getting a high load of heavy metals, chemicals, industrial solvents, rocket fuels, and whatever else is in our food and water, is really important. So even if we have to do reverse osmosis processes on our water and filter it through a Berkey, or add in some trace minerals and that sort of thing after the fact to simulate ideal natural conditions, then that's a good way of going about it too.
You bring up a good point about farmed fish, because if you were to ask me like a decade ago about farmed fish, I'd say hell no, especially knowing like the conditions back then where it's not a healthy environment for the fish. They're feeding the fish things like astaxanthin to make sure they actually get the color that they should have in a natural environment. They're artificially adding it in. But right, I agree with you though, because now it how the tables have turned. It's almost like the farmed fish, as long as it's farmed in a good way, it is often better than the wild caught, depending on what kind of fish you're eating. But I must say, I'm disappointed in some of what you said, because it doesn't sound like synthetic steak is gonna fit into this wild diet.
The whole thing about lab grown meats is certainly past the line that I've drawn for myself and for the people who, have kind of come along for the ride. Am I completely against the idea? I'm still somewhat open to the fact, in a similar way that like factory farmed fish, I would have absolutely said no 10 years ago. Now it seems like there's a responsible way of going about this. GMOs as well. Absolutely no. It now as well. Absolutely no. But is there a way of going about it that could actually improve human health? I think if there's a lot of research done, if time passes, there is a responsible way of going about combining science with the natural world. We don't have to completely draw that line forever, but that line has been drawn. And until the burden of proof is on them, if they can prove that humans can eat lab-grown meat for 80 to 100 years, and it's going to be as healthy or more healthy than eating what we already are, then it would be hard to be completely against that. But they certainly are not proving any of these things when they're telling us to eat cricket protein and lab-grown meats and GMOs and that sort of thing. These things are engineered to maximize profit and optimize that for the corporations, not to optimize our health. And so if we look around at the state of our health, whether it's adults or children, young or old, we might be living a longish time, but the quality of life is lower than ever. The quality of our health is very much lower than ever, or at least our vitality. We don't have the strength and the endurance that people even just a generation or two had. And we certainly don't have the mental fortitude that people used to have, the ability to kind of live through hard times and become stronger because of that. And so it's important to recognize that a lot of these newfangled substances aren't there to make us better. They're not there to make us healthier or to live longer. They're there to make short-term profits for the people who are high ups in an organization, maybe the shareholders. And is that really the system that we want to be eating out of? I would say no. And anyone who thinks that we should be eating bugs and eating lab-grown meats right now, I think should take a look at the data, or at least demand that research be done to see what the state of human health might be a few years from now if we start feeding all this stuff to all of our kids, because I don't think it's going to be pretty. And like I said, the burden of proof is on them, not on us.
You bring up some great points, because as scientifically minded people here, you and I think if you look at this objectively, there could be a strong case for the synthetic production of meats, but you got to look at, where are these efforts coming from? Who are the ones putting these efforts forward, and why are they doing it? Because when you start to look at those questions and you find the answers, people like Bill Gates, there's not a lot of evidence that he's doing this for reasons of health, that he actually cares about your health. You look at his financial investments and how much money he's made, and the things that he even says, like, hey, I'm in this to make money. I call it philanthro capitalism and all these sorts of things. Not necessarily with the food. That's not philanthropy, but he has a lot of suspicious financial ties that is worthy of scrutiny, and looking at these sorts of things closely. Whether we're talking about the synthetic meats or the bugs, which I've done a previous episode on, it's yeah, there doesn't seem to be a clamoring for eating insects in this country. There's no demand, and this is supposed to be in a free market, a country of supply and demand. Where is this demand for cricket powder? And you said that you have even seen that this effort has been going on for quite some time, and it just hasn't picked up traction. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I remember more than 10 years ago in the ancestral health community and the paleo circles, there were a lot of companies popping up that were super excited about selling cricket protein and some other bug proteins and putting them into flours and bars and trying to work them into recipes. And I've tried a few. I tried a bunch of different uh, bug options back then because I'm curious if there is,
Mhm.
some solution that I'm not aware of. I think it's important to entertain that. And if you look back in time, humans certainly have been eating bugs out of necessity for a long, long time. Starving humans who didn't have other options certainly would go for a big fat grub. And maybe in other instances, there are certain critters that are more like land shrimp, right? And like we all eat bugs of the sea. Eating bugs on land is something that seems like it shouldn't be completely out of the equation. But at the same time, when you look at the food chain, does it really make sense for humans to be eating cricket flour, which any flour degrades as soon as it's turned into a flour pretty quickly? When we look at eating things with exoskeletons and bugs, there's a reason we don't, because there's extremely high in all sorts of different parasites that could ruin our health. Maybe not right away, but over the course of time, like it will destroy you if you have the wrong kind of parasite. And is it really worth eating a very low cost cricket protein flour if that means that you're going to develop some parasite that eventually destroys your internal organs or does something else that we don't know? There's so much that we don't know yet, especially as you try to scale up a farm of bugs for human consumption, that it makes a heck of a lot more sense to me to feed these things to chickens and other animals that do eat bugs and thrive when they eat bugs, and then eat the chicken. Like, it's just, why? Okay, I know why. Because there's a lot more profit to be made with economies of scale if you're scaling up the bug flowers. But those cricket bars weren't cheap. That cricket flour was not cheap, and they hadn't figured out how to make it cheap back then. They haven't figured out how to make it cheap now, and you have to contrast it and compare it to the options for eating food that we have like this instant. And I know for a fact that most of us can get a pound of, let's say, 80/20 pasture raised, grass finished ground beef. You can get this right now at the grocery store, pretty much any of them. Don't have to buy it in bulk, for $8 or $10 a pound. It might be more than that down the road, certainly. But how much cheaper would bugs have to be for you to eat that instead? And would it do the same things nutritionally speaking that eating like beef liver or something that, especially organs from animals that we already eat, would it do better than that? Absolutely not. I would say absolutely not. Go and eat some oysters instead of crickets, and you're going to be doing yourself some favors. But most of the time, these things that are shopped around are done so to see how readily we will accept them into our own lives and consciousness. And if we say no as consumers, we vote with our dollar and we buy the healthy grass-fed meats, the pasture-raised chickens, the eggs. We go and eat some cheese here and there, and we stay away from all of this newfangled nasty stuff. The Beyond Meats, when you see it next to the actual meat, it's revolting. It's repugnant. And most people who have tried it have kind of like realized that it's not food. And some of these non-heme takes on artificially creating blood for us to eat aren't good for us to eat. These newfangled substances that they're creating to try to monetize the system even more, it's not making our food cheaper. It's not making us healthier. So we should just say no.
I agree. And it seems like a piece of the puzzle has kind of been removed, and they're trying to get us to eat what our food eats, which is definitely interesting. But it also brings up a good point about science that I wish more people understood, that science ultimately comes down to an argument. If you look at any scientific paper, you have a series of basically mandatory parts. So you have the materials used, which are all different variables. You have the actual methods and the process. You have the actual data. These are all things that aren't exactly open for interpretation. But then you get to the conclusions. That's where things are kind of open up to interpretation. And when it comes with bugs, you can look at all the science and the studies in the world, and there are actually a lot of really good arguments for something like, let's say, crickets with a good protein profile, a good omega profile. It's sustainable and all these different things that they use to try to get you to be interested in it. But again, that's just an argument, because if you were to push back on that sort of thing and you look a little bit closer, you realize that a component of their exoskeleton is not exactly digestible. You also mentioned the parasites. Like, am I going to get parasites? Because crickets often do have them. And I don't imagine these companies would or even have the means to eliminate the parasites from these crickets. And it becomes a mess. And so I would really implore people to, as always, use their skepticism towards these sorts of things, especially if it's under the guise of science, because science always comes down to an argument in every situation. Even with the food, medicine, you name it, it comes down to an argument, which brings me to my next question. And I just have a few more for you. What's the secret to weight loss, and why is it Ozempic?
I love it. Yeah, well, been doing this for quite some time now, and no one who I've worked with has needed drugs to get there. And the ones who have engaged with pharmaceutical approaches like HCG and some of the others that have been shopped around for a lot of time, in my experience, they've done a lot of damage to their own metabolism and their body over time, because that's not really the way that the body is meant to work. Can you hack the body? Yes, but I don't like that term. In the world of music, a hack is not a good thing. In the world of comedy too, right? Like, you don't want to be a hack, and you don't want to be hacking around with your body. And so, yeah, there's a lot of talk about Ozempic and many other things. And there are off-label uses for all sorts of different drugs that people have been using. in the world of health to try to achieve results for many, many moons. And if you look at the typical bodybuilder from the 70s, 80s, 90s, or even today, who's been on the juice, they don't typically age well. Is that really what we're after here? Because that's what the pharmaceutical intervention with human health kind of looks like. It might be pretty short term, but God, long term, you're doing all sorts of things. There is so much damage that you can do while trying to optimize for one thing that you don't realize that you're doing until it's too late. And the health of our organs and kind of like the unseen parts of our health, our internal health, is so much more important than what we see on the outside. Sometimes you can see it reflected, but you know, most of these procedures and new drugs that are shopped around are going to be incredibly profitable. They're going to cost you a lot of money if you want to use them, but they're not really necessary. I mean, generations before us did just fine eating real food and staying away from things that were toxic, staying away from things that changed the way that their body worked. And so I'm not really a big fan of the heavy-handed approach where we think, once again, man over nature. Hey, we have it all figured out. We're scientists. Trust us. You're going to look and feel great. All you have to do is go on testosterone for the rest of your life. All you have to do is take our drug and never stop. It's a great business plan, but it's not something that's going to lead to your health over the long term. And if you're talking about taking all of these various hormones or steroids and growth hormones and various things like that, I have never really seen it work out that well. I've seen some people engage in it for a short time and it seems like they're going to be okay. But for the most part, once you start taking something, it can do some pretty nasty permanent work from the inside out that you might not be aware of. So you're playing with fire. I'm not saying that some of this stuff can't work or can't achieve the goals that you're after, but I would look a little bit longer term and try to see, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing to look great on stage in a few weeks from now? Or are you optimizing trying to live a long and healthy life? And if you want to live a long and healthy life, you're going to need all your organs working as well as they possibly could. And I think you are stronger if you can remain healthy without anything exogenous for as long as possible than if you start relying on these exogenous substances to kind of keep you going or keep you at peak health. The sooner you start with all of that, I think the more you're signing yourself up for a lifetime of taking drugs. And that's really not what I'm after.
There does seem to be this unquestioned premise that we've accepted in society where it's totally okay to outsource aspects of quote unquote your health to pharmaceutical treatments. And this goes for depression, this goes for weight loss, this goes for many different things. And it's a shame because the state of fitness has become so far removed from health. You know, they used to be completely intertwined. And you pull up Instagram, you pull up TikTok, you see some of these fitness influencers. Some of them are really egregious in the way they will shame you for not wanting to even think about steroids. I mean, and look, I've worked in a gym for many years. I've worked with some of these meatheads. Some of them, you know, a lot of them I think are very nice people, well intentioned, but something happens, I think, when they modify their endocrine system by taking things like steroids for many years. And I've seen firsthand some of these people, the way their body deteriorates, and they still continue to demean people, marginalize people, look down on them for going like, yeah, I don't know, I don't think it's a good idea to take steroids. I mean, there are whole YouTube channels dedicated to people basically pushing steroids. Or now, I mean, Ozempic is all over TikTok. It's the state of fitness is really kind of a shame. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, to what end, right? Is there an end? Is there a long-term goal for any of this? Or are they just trying to get more views on TikTok? Is that really everyone's plan? Because if that's your plan, it doesn't seem like a long-term plan. And I totally agree with you. We see this more than ever. And it's important for people to realize that you can do a lot of damage that's unknown until it's too late. So be so careful with that stuff, because When you see people who have, organ failure at our age, or maybe a little bit older, was it really worth it to make your calves like a quarter inch bigger, or to try to get like, is it worth it to try to make your chest bigger, but ultimately you develop these man boobs and you have to have 7 or 8 procedures? One of my friends from college does those procedures, and trying to remove some of the extra tissue that's accumulated from taking these drugs over the years. And it keeps him very busy, and he's been rich for many years because like there is a constant influx of this sort of damage that comes in. And that's not, maybe that's the fitness world more than the health world, but it's certainly not healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not a lot of health in fitness nowadays. But I guess focusing on what is healthy and what is the right approach. I know some of the things that you talk about include OMAD, 1 meal a day. Uh, is that something that you would recommend to people? What does your food intake look like now? Or if, let's say, the general person were to ask you about this sort of thing, OMAD, or what is right for the average person, what would that sound like?
It's going to be a little bit different for everybody. But one thing that I think is a running theme is that most people can benefit from compressing their eating window. So if you're only eating for half the day or 8 hours or something like that, that can be extremely useful for a lot of people. Because what you don't want is to wake up first thing in the morning, start eating, get on this blood glucose and insulin roller coaster for the rest of the day, where you're spiking your blood sugar. And as soon as it drops an hour or two later, you're hungry again, so you need a snack, and then it goes up, and you're running on these carbs and these sugars all day. It's that takes its toll on your system. Whereas if you start eating, this is how I began. So I had been a runner and running marathons, really interested in trying to optimize my performance back then. So I had been carb loading many, many years ago and eating these meals every 2 to 3 hours. And that's what was happening to me. Up and down. My energy was up and down. I didn't feel mentally all that clear, and I didn't feel all that healthy, but I did feel ravenous every few hours, and I had to just keep eating or else I was out of gas, out of steam. A lot of people have experienced this. So the way that I got around that was by experimenting with pushing breakfast until lunch. And so at the beginning, I instead of eating at, say, like 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, I'd push it until 10 a.m., then 11 a.m. over the course of a few days, a few weeks. And then noon seemed like a really good time for me to, usually I would get like a half meal, maybe even a full meal in at noon, do my workout in the afternoon, do another big meal post-workout, and that was about it. And I realized that I didn't really get hungry in the morning until I started eating, especially started eating carbs. So it's more about managing blood glucose and insulin. And yes, making sure that you reach the caloric load ultimately and kind of hit your macros for the day later. That's an important thing to do, but you don't have to do it every 2 hours. And your energy might be a lot higher, even if you're not eating. And so once I got used to the 16-8 style fast, where you have that 8-hour eating window. Some people do it early in the day, where you start eating and you're on the clock for like your 8 hours, and you'll stop eating around 2 or 3, or maybe even just after lunch. Not to say that you can never have another snack again, but if you engage in this over time, you build that muscle of being able to perform well and feel good without food, then your body can liberate its fat stores, and you go to burning fat, using that for energy, as opposed to needing this constant influx of sugar. And if you're using it for fuel, whether you're talking about running or just living your life, then sugar and carbs, flour, that sort of thing, processed baked goods, cereals, all the rest of that, is kind of like high octane, short-term fuel. And there's a use case for it, especially post-workout. If you want to build a bunch of muscle, or you want to recover quickly, refuel your glycogen stores in your liver and your muscle, it's something that can be played with a little bit. But what you don't want to do is be hitting those high glycemic carbs first thing in the day. So it's a very valuable tool, that compression of the eating window, intermittent fasting in your own way. And ultimately, I tried eating 1 meal a day, which meant about a 4 hour eating window, sometimes even 2 or 3 hours. And that seemed to work really well for me for many years. But now I'm more back to like the 16-8 style of fasting on most days. And I feel like that's a good balance, and pushing it too far as well. Like, you don't want to be under fueling and under eating for too long. It's better to kind of have these days where you're under eating a little bit, say on your rest days, and then on the days that you're doing a big expenditure of energy, whether you're training for a triathlon or you're hitting the weights or something, hopefully you're doing something with your body to keep it strong and fast and healthy and mobile. Then you kind of engage in the overeating and eating of your treats on those days, and looking at your overall diet over the course of a week can be a lot more useful for people than just looking at a single day, because every day shouldn't be exactly the same. That can work for some people, but the cycling of calories and cycling of nutrients, especially carbs, can be really beneficial if you want to get your body composition in order and then maximize performance as well. So if people haven't experimented with intermittent fasting, know that you can throw it in your bag of tricks, but also more isn't always better. And it's just like another thing that you can try. It is a hormetic stressor. So if you're not getting good sleep, you find physiologically that you're kind of burning the candle at both ends, or certainly if you're pregnant or you're a child, like, not going to work well for you. But for a lot of people, this is something that can be a nice tool to throw in that bag of tricks.
Definitely. It's something I've messed around with myself. It can definitely work, and I like to be strategic and set periods of time to mess with these sorts of things, because then I'll have my cheat days, which sometimes can just snowball into cheat weeks, which can be a disaster. Um, and you mentioned some of the ways snacks can be strategically used. I would just add one more that I've tried when I was putting on weight, while trying to put on weight myself, would be actually starting with some sugary, terrible for you snack. And then it makes you voracious and you just want to keep eating and eating. And so if somebody's trying to put on weight, maybe that's not the healthiest approach, but that's something that worked pretty well for me. Now how about, and this is where we'll start to really wind down here with exercise, like basically the same question. So I've read that you talk about like mini exercises versus one. And for me, like I've noticed I really enjoy lifting weights. I enjoy working out. I can easily, especially after I'm in it, even if I say I'm going to work out for an hour, I can find myself for 2 hours, maybe even three, but that's pushing it. And then I'm just worn out for the next 5 days or something like that. So, where's the balance for you, or where do you find is the balance for most people, if there even is such a thing?
Yeah, well, once again, it's all about like your goals, but most of us don't approach exercise uh, in the way that is probably most effective for our physiology, for our bodies, where you want to reach this threshold of signaling where you're telling your body to grow, your muscles to grow or to get faster. And we're adapting against whatever we're uh, throwing at our body. So like, for example, if I go out and I'm not really that well trained for it, which I'm not right now because I haven't been running this summer. It's too dang hot. But sometimes I'll go out and I'll run 9 or 10 miles. And is that just a sufferfest that's going to, crush me for the next 5 days? In many cases, yes. If I do it the wrong way, you're not trained up for it, and you run too far, you don't have anything left in the tank, and that includes like the rest of your life. What else are you going to have to do for the next 5 days? Like show up at work or do something that's productive to pay your bills, show up for your family. And also, I made this mistake a lot when I was running marathons is I would underfuel, I would overtrain, and then I would get sick, like actually sick. I'd get the flu for the next week or something after a big run. And so you can do that to yourself no matter what you're doing, aside from maybe walking. Walking is maybe like the one thing that it's very difficult to overdo. But with every other aspect of training, what you really want to do is get to the point where you tell your muscles to stay there, especially as you age. You want to maintain some level of muscle mass, and you want to make sure that your balance stays on point, your mobility and all the rest of that. But also, if you want to grow, number two, that's where things are a little bit different. But there's a big, and I love lifting weights too. And these exercises can work against each other. Being a distance runner and lifting heavy weights is kind of a silly thing to do for my body. And I understand that. So it's important to space these out on different days. And also give yourself rest, because you're not building muscle when you're in the gym, so to speak. You're building it when you're at rest. So prioritizing sleep is extremely important, and giving yourself a proper rest day after those massive expenditures of energy is going to be so important. I remember being a kid, I grew up around some really highly ranked mountain bikers who were ranked nationally, and the dude was doing so well. He was a really good friend, the older brother of a really good friend of mine. And his biggest problem was overtraining. And I'm just like, what? What is that? How could that be a problem? And it turns out your body goes catabolic really, really quickly and easily. If you go past that line where you tell your body, these muscles need to stay here, adapt against this. I know I'm breaking them down right now, but you'll get some rest right here. If you push past that and you keep redlining, then you go catabolic. You start eating your own muscle. You start kind of attacking your own organs. You start getting weak and frail. Instead of getting faster and stronger, you get worse. And so many of us are doing this without actually realizing it. And so if you are engaged in heavy strength work, try to focus on that day to get the hormonal whole body benefit of that training. Give yourself proper rest after that. And if you're doing that kind of strength training, then you really don't need it much more than like once or twice a week, maybe 3 times a week. And even that, like maybe 20 or 30 minutes for each of those sessions is all you really need, with plenty of rest in between. You can do it for longer, especially if your rest intervals are nice and long and luxurious, which they should be, especially if the years are ticking by. Like the older I get, the more rest I feel like I need, or I certainly want. So it's important to prioritize recovery within your workouts too. But really, you want to get to that point where you're signaling your body that you want to get stronger. And if you want to put on mass, there are certain ways of going about that. If you want to get stronger, that's a little bit different. So you can kind of go down all these different rabbit holes. But suffice it to say that a lot of people are not getting enough exercise. Huge problem. So whatever you can do to address that fact and get out there most days with like a nice, easy walk, doing 20 or 30 minutes of walking spread throughout the day is going to be good for almost everyone who is able to do that. And if you're not, physically able to do that, that's one thing. But if you're making excuses that you're not able to do that, that's a totally different thing. So try to work it into your schedule. And then as it relates to strength training, I think almost everyone should be strength training in one way or another, even if it's just grabbing a light kettlebell, learning how to do some kettlebell swings and doing that once a week. That can totally transform your results. But as soon as you make it to failure in your sets, you're pretty much done. Maybe one more set after failure. And I'm not big at, trying to push 11 out of 10 in terms of effort and going to failure. Your form is really important. And if you want to do this for a long time, the number one priority of your training should be to not get injured. So do it with the right form, and easier said than done, right? Because like I get caught up in this too. It's like, oh, I can do one more, but it's like, ooh, my back shouldn't bend like that. That doesn't count, So make sure you're doing it with the right form, not too often, and then do a nice proper refeed too. For a lot of people who want to go out and do those cheat meals, those treat meals, that's a great excuse for feeding afterwards, after your big expenditure of energy, whether it's lifting weights or something else.
Yeah, and it all comes down to the nervous system too, because that's really like, even looking past, oh, my muscles are fatigued, it really does come down to that. And it's something I think that's important for people to think about when they are training for just general health versus training for actual physical performance. Because I've worked with, and I'm sure you've worked with people like this too, people who are, they come to you for some kind of health or fitness work, but really they're like a business person. They're a CEO of some company and they want to stay in shape. But for me, when I hear that, that adds an extra element of caution, because even for myself with this podcast, I've totally changed my workout routine because if I were to continue burning myself out in the gym just because I like lifting the weights, it it fries my nervous system in a way that takes a hit on mental performance too, because it's all coming from that same nervous system. And so training for mental performance is totally different than training for physical performance, and definitely something to think about. But my last question for you here, what else? Is there anything that I did not ask you or anything that did not come up that maybe we should discuss before we end this?
I would just encourage people to open their eyes uh, to all of the different ways of going about this, and what you see on Instagram and on TikTok. It's amazing how fad based most of most of the discussion has become in the world of health. You know, having been having these conversations for a long time with a lot of different people, I've seen many different concepts come and go. None of them pretty much are new, you know, except for a pharmaceutical here or there. But even the pharmaceuticals that pop up are pretty much just similar to other ones that have come up in the past too. And so they have their time in the sun, they have their time in the spotlight, and then they pass along too. And so what people have a tendency to do is hop from one thing to another, or even hop from like one creator or influencer or channel to another one. They'll try one thing and then they're just like, oh, I'm done with this guy. I would challenge people to go to the real, the source of where many of these ideas come from, like Dr. Jack Kruse. You hear so many people talking about his ideas, but rarely do you actually hear the words from his own mouth, you know, because he's not really concerned with getting the credit. And a lot of the people who are coming up with these ideas and the people who live by these principles, they don't really consider them ideas that they own, because these fundamentals of health aren't something that can be owned. They're too obvious. They're too real. They're not there to make money off of them. So I would encourage people to try to be a little more intentional about what you're letting in, because this is programming your subconscious too, right? If you're going out and looking at all these different approaches to health, and one's over here and it's extreme, it's all about eating meat and water all the time. And then you have the other version of the carnivore diet where it's all about eating organs all the time, plus fruit. And then you have this other one where it's just eating no animal foods ever, and you're eating vegan food, but not processed, or it's not vegan unless it's raw. And it's like, that is really getting caught up in the weeds, because how many people actually went for a walk today, made sure that they got some omegas for their brain, made sure that they hit their needs for their protein around, you know, their stress levels, and how's your nervous system doing? Are you self-tracking and looking at your sleep data and your heart rate variability, all these various things. You can go down any rabbit hole, but what's most important is, how does this translate into action in your own life? What can you do today, tomorrow, in the weeks and the months ahead to make sure that you stay on the right track and you don't get distracted by all these ridiculous, shiny and blinking things across social media? Same thing that's happened with music has kind of happened with health. It used to be long form conversations and kind of deep dives into these various ways of thinking about things. Now it's just so superficial, or at least a lot of the conversations online and on social media are. I would encourage people to go take a listen to long form conversations like this with the people who have written the books, with the people who have done the research, and, you know, save the time when you're scrolling on social media for goofing off and having a bit of fun later. But don't take any of that too seriously, because I find that a lot of people are taking some of these 30 and 60-second videos very seriously. But the problem is, it's so easy to make something that's short form like that with sound effects and all of these blinking lights and things like that. It's easy to say things that don't really have any basis in fact, or just part of the truth, because you don't have to provide any data or evidence that says that this thing is true or that it works. If you're talking for a couple of hours about a topic, or certainly an hour, and you're talking about the subjects of books or the subjects of research papers, then you can really get into it and you can learn something. So I would encourage you, if you're looking at the world of health, go for those deep dives, and more than anything, go and read some books. Get your little health library going, because that's my favorite way to learn. It's more difficult, to kind of challenge yourself to read on a regular basis for some people, because maybe it's less blinking and shiny lights and less dopamine signaling than we get from most of the things on the internet these days. But man, if you want to learn, that's the way to do it. Go and get some books, and even better, read those books and then listen to those authors, or even interview them yourself. You'd be amazed by how many of these people who write books are just like one interview away. So if you can start up your own platform and start learning yourself, that's an incredible way to move forward in the world of health. And it's so worth it. Having done hundreds and hundreds of episodes over the years, it's one of my favorite ways to spend time, because people who, spend their lives doing research and writing books really care about this a lot. They have a lot to share. And, people on TikTok may or may not. It's hard to know.
Yeah, those are all such great points. And Mr. Abel James, the fat burning man, best-selling author and musician, where can people find more about you?
You can find me at abeljames.com, abeljames.com, or if you're interested in recipes and the health side of things and the podcast, then you can look up Fat Burning Man wherever you find your podcasts, or just go to fatburningman.com. There's a lot of fun to be had.
Awesome. Well, Abel, thanks again. This was such an enjoyable conversation. So much gold in this episode. I can't wait myself to go back and re-listen to this one. So thank you.
Righteous. Thank you so much for having me, Mike.